It's a joy to me to have Jeff Chang, who's a dear friend and collaborator, uh, one of the one of the smartest people that I know, honestly, and perhaps significantly one of the most generous people that I know as well in terms of blending mind and heart in all of his work. His first book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, is used in college classrooms all over the United States and won him the American Book Award. That's kind of nice. It's nice. And his second book, or third book, Who We Be, The Colorization of America, came out in 2014 to critical acclaim. It was published in 2016 as a paperback. It's over there in the bookstore with the title Who We Be, A Cultural History of Race in Post-Civil Rights America. And of course, the book that we're going to talk about today is We're Going to Be All Right. Right here, he took my copy, which is Notes on Race and Resegregation. The book is a compilation of seven or eight essays that have the incredible, and I know all of you aspiring writers are very jealous because how did he manage to write a short and small book that packs such a punch? That's what we all want. And I've seen people carry the book in their purses and read it in line at Starbucks and things like that. So the book has become one of those manifestos that is very, very useful for artists and activists. Jeff was raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. He's a graduate of the Iolani School. He went to the University of Berkeley and UCLA, and now he is the director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University, where he is doing some incredible work in addition to writing and publishing all the time. So we are going to get started, and I have asked Jeff to do us the honor of the author to begin and set us off by reading a portion of the book. Should we do that? And then set the tone.
Thank you. Thank you, Maribel. But first, I just want to say thank you to the Tucson Book Festival staff and to the Southwest Folk Alliance staff, Folk Life Alliance staff, for all of the hard work and generosity. And I just want to say, Maribel used to be in the Bay Area, and we lost her to you all. And I'm still mourning that loss in so many ways because Maribel is so visionary. She calls me generous. I think of Maribel as the most generous, one of the most generous people I know, and a brilliant writer and somebody who always works to cross boundaries to sort of. I'm embarrassing you, but it's all true. I just need to let you know, and I need to let everybody know. And I just think we should show Maribel some love. So much love.
One love.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll start. I'll just read a short portion of this. I'll see if I can find the. I see. Okay. So I'll start here. Race makes itself known in crisis, in the singular event that captures a larger pattern of abuse and pain. We react to crisis with a flurry of words and sometimes actions. In turn, the reaction sparks its own backlash of outrage, justification, and denial. The cycle turns next towards exhaustion, complacency, and paralysis. And before long, we find ourselves back in crisis. Racism is not merely about individual chauvinism, prejudice, or bigotry. Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us that it is about the ways different groups are vulnerable to premature death, whether at the hands of the state or the structures that kill. And We Gonna Be All Right, I look at some of the ways in which we have slid back towards segregation. To be sure, there has never been a time when we did not live separately. In 2014, more than 300 school districts across the country were still involved in active desegregation orders dating to the civil rights era. At the same time, even as we have mostly come to celebrate diversity, resegregation is happening all around us. in our neighborhoods and schools, our colleges and universities, even the culture. The culture wars have obscured and exacerbated these facts. Worse, they have left us without a common understanding or language that might help us to end them. What today's activists, organizers, and artists are giving us are new ways to see our past and our present. Even more, they are giving us the directive to address inequality and inequity now, to make it clear that if we do not do so, we will continue to be drawn back into the bad cycle, just as we were after 1965 and after 1992. Right now, we have the opportunity to get it right. Our shared future depends upon it.
Wow, thank you. Incredible. Jeff, you write always on that edge, on that uncomfortable, but also incredible creative edge of uh, despair and hope, right? I mean, calling it out, speaking the truth of the divided moment we are, and yet always looking to communities that are creating alternatives. And one of the great contributions your work has brought about has been this thesis about how culture is always uh, anticipating politics at the same time sort of organizing it, right? So most of the time for good. We've been lots of examples of, Joe Louis before there was civil rights, Ellen DeGeneres before we had Supreme Court decision, all of those things in the culture, in the water, right? But how do we make sense of this particular cultural moment? The culture seems to be itself the site of despair and hope.
Well, I think the last two books, Who We Be and then this book, We Gonna Be Alright, have been about trying to understand what's happening in our present moment as the return of the culture wars in so many ways, and that this has been something that that has been steadily picking up since the election of Barack Obama, and that we find ourselves now in this moment of backlash, and it's sort of an extended kind of backlash against the advances or the visible or perceived sort of advances of communities of color. And so Obama moves from being a symbol of hope to being a symbol of derogation immediately upon election. Between 2008 and 2009, we see this battle opening up over just who Obama is. And the birther controversy, I think, is a large part of that. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to, and when I say we, I mean a lot of us who have been working in the culture, including yourself, the Southwest Folklife Alliance, and so many others across the country, has been to say that it's really important that we attend to what's happening in the culture, because we kind of live in a moment in which politics feels and has felt as if it's stalemated, in which it's very difficult for us to pass big pieces of legislation, and that when they are, they're getting attacked, right? This is where we're at right now with Obamacare, which has become sort of a symbolic battle as well as a battle over our policy and the redistribution of wealth in this country. And so when we kind of look at it in that way, what we see is this cycle of culture wars going all the way back through U.S. history. And so for me, I wrote Who We Be and I wrote We Gonna Be Alright, in part because the culture war has really shaped my youth. I came of age in the late 80s and the early 90s. And as a student at UC Berkeley, there was a huge debate about the efficacy of multiculturalism. Some people argued, well, multiculturalism is just going to balkanize us and divide the country and leave us unable to talk to each other, and we're going to all retreat to our warring ethnic camps. And others were like, actually, multiculturalism is the way that the U.S. has always been. What we need to do is recognize that demographic change and cultural change is not only, here, it's welcome, that it's something that will lead us to a more vital democracy. And so this is my experience coming in, to to my consciousness, as they say, in the 80s and the 90s. And I recognized that when I began to teach students that this history wasn't the kind of thing that was actually often talked about. It was something that we suppressed. And that's part of this sort of exhaustion process, that we don't ever deal with these kinds of questions that get raised in these cycles of crisis, that we sort of talk them through. We have this sort of push, this backlash, and then we're just exhausted. And then we end up in another crisis. And so I felt like it was important for me to kind of capture these things, to be able to tell my students, look, and especially, I mean, in retrospect, it feels like it was the right thing to do for all the wrong reasons. But it was the right thing to do because now I feel like, well, my job is to really equip my students to be able to understand history, both recent and past, in order to be able to make it through this particular historical moment.
I remember a time when the early 90s, late 80s, in some of the great moments of hip hop history, where you looked at a crowd and you saw young people sort of pushing through labels of identity and working around a sort of aesthetic and a concern for a different world. And all of a sudden you get really hopeful. And at the same time that some of those things were happening, uh, there were things like that show, The Apprentice, where, normalizing sort of a CEO that is a strong man who comes and knows how to fix things. And so the culture seems always to be working in that way, that it's opening things up and then it's also normalizing things. And who knew, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Wow. Um, Absolutely. And I think, reality shows, we all watch them. There was a point where we were putting up a resistance to them, but we all watched whatever Food Network star. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like we watch all of these different Top Chef. I don't know. Project One Way. We watch these shows, and what's interesting is that in these shows, there's sort of this this narrative of there's a very limited amount of resources, and because of that scarcity, you have to really compete to be able to hang on your own. You know what I mean? And so this is sort of reinforcing all of the, as much as we enjoy them, they reinforce all of the basis aspects of what a capitalist society does to us, and they sort of push back the values of inclusion and community building and those kinds of things. If community is being built on survivor, say, it's temporary. These are alliances because one person is still wanting to be the survivor at the end, right? My son's favorite show is Survivor, so I can just,
Yeah.
but so I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about culture prospectively, what we're saying is that you know people are always in the culture, and there's always a burden on people who want to see something different, who want to see freedom, who want to see justice, to actually articulate an alternative to that, to the mass of folks, and to do it in a way that makes it irresistible, right? That was Tony Cade Bambara, the great novelist, word. Like, the job of the revolution, the job of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible, and to be able to imagine a world that hasn't been yet. And everything else is maintaining the status quo. So all the other side has to do is to mobilize and appropriate the sort of images of change into reinforcing the status quo. And so we always have that burden when we're trying to change the world, to get people to think big, to imagine, to think of things, to dream of things that have not yet been made manifest.
In the book, there's some incredible passages, and one idea that circulates throughout, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and sometimes stayed up at night. Thank you. Is
I
the
hope you're getting
notion
enough rest, though.
a little bit of rest.
You do so much.
A lot of restlessness.
A
These
lot of
days.
restlessness these days, for sure. Yeah.
But you talk about, you're trying to walk that terrain where you're trying to demonstrate these the resegregation, the separation, the lack of connection that we have with one another. And at the same time, you're trying to be compassionate and empathetic to the plight of white poor people who have sort of like became the deplorables, right, in that sort of scenario that we saw played out. And you talk about the word mutuality, the construction of a mutual, and you have some incredible phrases where you said, but we live in a time when merchants of division draw us away from mutuality and towards the undoing of democracy itself. And in the end of your book, the last chapter, and this is, you've been taken to task by several national correspondents for this who have written about your book, where you're trying to be hopeful because the book is, after all, called We're Gonna Be All Right. But then when you read the last sentence, the last paragraph, it's like, wow, what to make. Each one of us is left with the question, can we, given all the pain that we have inflicted upon us and that we have inflicted upon others, ever learn to see each other as lovers do, to find our way to a freedom for all? And then you follow with this beautiful sentence, but very sobering. The horizon toward which we move always recedes before us. Are we going to be all right? Tell us, please.
I mean, I think, it's a very difficult moment, and I think that we are confronting crises that are larger than we've seen, in recent years. But I guess I'm buoyed by two things. One is so in that last chapter, I'm also talking about the work of Beyonce, because and it's got to be the last chapter because after Beyonce, there's nothing left to say, right? And Beyonce raises all.
I told you he's smart.
Beyonce raises all these questions in the video and the album of Lemonade that I think intersect with all of these really interesting thoughts that are happening and work that's happening by Black artists and Black thinkers, and so so Lemonade, for those of everybody knows Lemonade, right? So the plot line basically is just sort of the breaking up and the rekindling of love between two partners, and what's really interesting about it is in so many ways the parts that feel most immediate and authentic are the songs that are where she's in her rage period. And that's partly because pop culture does this really good thing, especially I think youth culture does this really good thing of being able to capture rage. And so when she's mad at her lover, the video has her throwing bombs and taking a bat that's called hot sauce to the cars and just wrecking shit. And can I say that? Is that okay? Okay. So I don't know. She's just wrecking things, and then the last song is sort of like, one way to read it is that when you make up, you can have really great sex, but it's so much deeper than that, right? It's really about, because that's the chorus, but the verses are about struggling through what it means to kind of find your own redemption, and then in finding your own redemption, what it means to be able to make a peace and be able to move on, and in that, it requires a certain kind of sense of generosity, a certain sense of grace. And I think that's the work, for instance, that Carrie Mae Weems is doing right now. She's exploring this idea of grace. Like, is grace the kind of thing that sustains the movement for freedom, the Black freedom movement, and has sustained it through all of these decades, through the centuries? And if so, what does that look like? How does that become manifest? And so she's looking at young Black Lives Matter activists, and she's also looking at older Black women elders in her community and trying to understand this notion of grace. And she was inspired by Barack Obama, right, as not a figure of sort of post-raciality, but as a figure of grace amidst all of this pressure and backlash. And then the work of Robin Kelly, who is citing James Baldwin in turn and talking about the politics of love. Like, how do we extend to those who have wronged us a chance for their redemption in order to reach a sense of equity, right? And it's not about, and even King was like this in his later years, right? It's not necessarily about turning the other cheek, right? It's about punching back if you need to, but it's about the fact that that's not the end of this, right? That the end is not perpetuating a cycle of violence, which is essentially all that racism is. It's a form of violence that gets perpetuated from generation, reproduced from generation to generation. But it's about escaping that cycle of crisis and violence into something that's better. So some national pundits might have been like, well, that's too sort of, ethereal, utopic, like unreal, impossible. But I think that that's exactly the place that we need to be in at this particular moment in history.
Yesterday you were talking, follow up on that idea that there are some creative legislative agendas and policy inventive that can actually get us there. Might it be that one of the shifts may happen through the debate on Obamacare as some of the alliances shift, and there's a possibility of empathy at a social, political level of policy. I mean, I know that policy is a great interest that you have, even though I don't think any of your books, other than the Cultural Wars, have specifically looked at multicultural policy in the arts world. But is there some hope there of some realignment that you can see?
I think there's a lot. I mean, there's always a ton of work that's happening, right? All the time, and uh, I trust in the process of folks getting together at local levels to be able to make change in their communities and neighborhoods, um, and that adds up to something more. That it's not just somebody sort of reaching out in the dark, but that there's the sort of pebble in the water effect, and that there's going to be ripples. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of different types of things that are happening in different types of fields that folks are always pushing on. I mean, I was just in DC this past week. We were talking about health equity issues, but then that moved into thinking about housing. It moved into thinking about community organizing. And then it moved into even thinking about questions about culture and trauma in the community. So how does one think about trauma, how it's impacted individuals and communities, and then how do we address that in terms of setting up systems to repair that harm for folks to be able to heal and also to be able to move towards wholeness, towards better community outcomes, better health outcomes, better housing outcomes, better policy outcomes. So that's one example, and I think that the flip side of this of all of the stuff that's kind of been happening since November has been that we've had justice movements over the last 6 or 7 years reach critical mass. And so when Trump was elected, people were at a state of high alert. And I feel like if you look at the Women's March and you look at the movement for Black Lives and you look at the movement for migrant justice, you look at the movement for climate justice, you look at reproductive freedom, reproductive justice, all of these different types of things, Standing Rock, the environmental justice question and protection of water, all of these movements are at a stage of high alert. And I think that the Women's March was amazing. J21, you have 4 million people out there. That's more than 1 in every 100, Americans that are out there in the streets. And that is something that's powerful. That is something that's an act of breaking through the imagination. I didn't mention economic justice. Obviously, all of these different types of things are wrapped up into the question of where we need to go next. And the Women's March, and it makes perfect sense that it would be led by women, but that these questions would be raised together as part of the unity principles, right? And so some people debate, well, is environmental justice a feminist issue? And the answer is, of course it is, right? Or is climate justice, is racial justice, is economic justice a feminist issue? Of course it is. The intersectionality of these issues is what generated all of that force and that power. And so it makes sense for women who are standing at the intersection of all these different types of issues to be leading the way in this particular moment. And that's part of what gives me hope. Um, so often people are like, well, how do we translate that then immediately into policy? And I think the point is to understand that we are all working at different levels at once, and that we all have to work on multiple fronts at once. And so if we can get away from that sort of notion of there being sort of one leader and there being a central command, right, and understanding that the way that change happens is through people acting in their own space and time through their identities, then we get to a point where we can really understand how we can change this dramatically for the better.
And you've always talked about having the joy of what you're doing be the joy of what you're doing,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
You're creating, you're writing.
Yeah.
It's a powerful tool, right? That's what you do. One of the at the same time, you don't let anyone off easy. In the chapter that you title is diversity for white people, and you take a really deep dive into trying to understand how sometimes we have set ourselves up for some of these sort of societal failures by hovering on the surface of things without really talking about the stuff that really matters. How is that chapter getting received everywhere you go?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's a mixed bag, but it's a very simple point that I'm trying to make, which is that we've uncoupled diversity from equity, and so that's why we end up back in crisis all the time, and so we have to literally repair diversity with equity. So it's possible for us in this particular moment to be able to have had a black president, to be able to have had like all of the images that we see on TV. All of the reality shows are the most diverse shows that you'll see on TV, except for maybe Grey's Anatomy and anything else written by Shonda Rhimes, right? But like, what's really happening here, right? Are there questions that are being raised within this, and are there actual changes that are being made? And what's factual, right, behind the images of sort of our happy rainbow country is that the divides have widened around policing, around mass incarceration, around wealth, income, and ultimately health and life expectancy, right? And so, hence the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, the biggest gap is still between blacks and whites in terms of life expectancy. And so it's these kinds of questions that should be troubling us, and yet diversity in some ways is a substitute. The picture of diversity is a substitute for looking at these kinds of questions and trying to address those types of questions. And what we've seen over the last 5 decades has been a steady dismantling and destruction of the structures that were put in place to try to move us towards equity. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we're actually now in a state of widened inequality, inequity, and resegregation.
Michelle Obama once said that if you want to understand Barack Obama, you have to understand Hawaii. And you're a Hawaiian. uh, does having come from that multicultural community that is Hawaii, does it give you a vantage point to understand the politics that were unfolded over the last 8 to 10 years?
I think in some ways it may have. I think there's a really like easy way to kind of sum it up. It's sort of a Pollyanna-ish way to sum it up, and then there's something that's a little bit more deeper than that. So let me start with the real basic, sort of soundbitey type of thing, which is that I grew up in a family that has been in the islands for 5+ generations and has intermarried every which way, and so like our family pictures look like the United Nations, exactly the same way that Obama's family pictures did and do as well. And so and so I do have this really sort of basic kind of Pollyannish view of the world of like everybody should be like my family. Like, sometimes you have like the uncle that that annoys you, or the auntie who kisses you too hard, or the cousin who's always like getting into trouble, getting drunk, all of those kinds of things. But you're at the same, by the same token, like you all have to eat from the same table, and so that's sort of a metaphor for folks trying to figure out ways to be able to work it out. That's like the sort of soundbitey type of way that it could be understood. But I also think too that what the history of Hawaii shows is that Hawaii hasn't eradicated racial inequality. It hasn't eradicated ethnic hierarchies at all. Native Hawaiians are still at the bottom of every social index. At the same time that everybody embraces a very Native Hawaiian influenced culture, which we've now called like local culture. We all kind of speak pidgin English to each other. We speak this interlanguage to each other, but that doesn't necessarily prevent us from having views of other ethnicities that replicate colorism that might be seen in other kinds of societies. And so there's simultaneously like this thing of like you're having to work it out in a very personal kind of a way, right? And then you're also very, very aware of all the things that need to be done in order to get to where it possibly could be. And I think that that's in some ways, and it gives you sort of a pragmatism, I think. And I think that's in some ways sort of what's shaped me.
In the book, there's a reference that you make. Of course, you spoke about this yesterday a little bit. Of the inspiration for the book was visiting Ferguson, and coming back and writing like a madman, sort of a heartfelt reaction to what you have experienced there. And there was you make references to certain sort of geographic locations where things are working themselves out in really curious ways, right? With some retreat and then some advances. I know that you spent time in Arizona in 2010, Culture Strike that you formed, which is now a national network of artists doing incredible work, came out of that moment. You brought Maxine Kingston to Tucson. I mean, it was just like a crazy moment at that time. 6 years later, you are mentioning St. Louis, Missouri, Ferguson, and you have a quote about in Ferguson, the black resistance revealed the structure of what America has become. Does Arizona play a part in that sort of geographic realignment of potentiality and at the same time retreat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in Ferguson, there's sort of a slogan that they have there that I think is absolutely true, which is Ferguson is everywhere, right? And so the results, the effects of resegregation over the last 5 decades have been revealed in Ferguson, and the one of the thrusts of the movement was to make that clear to everybody. And I think that that's the fuel that's gotten us to be able to understand the sort of inequities and resegregation that's occurred. That's certainly part of my process as well. I mean, that happened to me, so I think it's happened to millions of us because of that. And I think by the same token, what's happening here in Arizona, when we were here in 2010, 2011, we brought down a delegation of 50 artists to bear witness at the sort of as guests. We were guests of local artists and activists here in Arizona who took us to see the border, to see what was happening with 1070, with all the racial profiling that was happening, what was happening with the school system and ethnic studies. And our job was to go and sort of amplify that. And many of us did. Teju Cole writes in his new book about his trip. Maxine Kingston has talked about it a lot. Jessica Hagedorn, a whole bunch of people who were on that trip. We were all indelibly we're just totally indelibly like moved and influenced by that. And I think that what Tucson, what Arizona kind of reminds us is that we live in this mixed up borderland in which politics have been arbitrary. The border was drawn arbitrarily. It's drawn right through Tohono O'odham land. It divides all of these folks' like places where they've lived for thousands of years, and at the same time has divided families and continues through the process of deportation to divide families through family separation and through detention and all these different types of things. And so one of the things that I think we were moved to understand is how arbitrary that is, how inhumane that can be, and that the impact of our policies in that regard have to always be attentive to the fact that it's not about the formal law, it's about what's happening to human beings. Human beings can change the laws. The laws are an affect of or an effect of what we do and how we think. And so it recentered us in terms of our values. And I think that this is Tucson in that way is like Honolulu, right? It's a place where all kinds of cultures are mixing together. Folks are figuring it out on a day-to-day type of basis, and that's the beauty of it. That's the brilliance of it, and it's also something that we have to take care of, right? That we have to be attentive to the ways in which our freedom to be able to mix is constantly being constrained, and that's because people are being contained, and so I think that that's something for us to kind of move forward.
There was a time in the last 5-10 years when a lot of that imagination and proposal for the future was kind of hinging on demographic change. You had demographers, and you also, we were part of that Ford Foundation project where, just about the new America coming together, the demographics. And then very quickly, which is very disheartening, how quickly we are ready to abandon, certain paradigms and move on. And after the election, it's like, well, that didn't turn out to be that good. The demographics didn't deliver the votes that we wanted. And so very short-term sort of approach to that. You did so much work in Who We Be, around the demographic changes in the country. In Arizona, I remember in many of our conversations was sort of pivotal for that, right? That tipping point of the youth developing the aging population. But is demographics still one of the tropes that can help us?
I think, I mean, it's not a trope, it's a fact, right? We're heading in this direction, and the scariest thing about it to me, and I think the urgency behind it for all of us, is that I look at my students and I see a generation that's more demographically diverse than ever, right? Than any previous generation, and yet they've grown up under resegregation, and so what are we heading towards? We're heading towards a society that is becoming more diverse, but at the same time becoming more segregated, and that's a recipe for a national disaster. If we want to frame it in a national kind of a way, if we want to frame it in a strictly policy kind of a sense, right? But it's about really trying to figure out how we make this work, how we make this American experiment work in the long run, and I think that this is the central question that I tell all my students. The two major questions that you're going to be facing is one, how we classically, completely intersectional issue figure out the question of climate change, right? And the second issue is how, if we are all minorities, do we figure out how to form a new majority? And I think that the two of them go hand in hand. And so, yeah.
I want to make sure that I have time for all of your questions and conversation with Jeff, but before I do that, I couldn't help but, I told you this, I asked a nerdy question about writing itself.
Yeah.
The essays here in this book are sort of like perfectly crafted gems, and I know that it's not to just make you feel, you know.
It does. Thank you.
It's because, but they each have an idea, right? They each have an idea, and you work through that idea, and then you move on to the new idea in the next shorter essay, and there's a certain sort of elegant narration about both the personal. There's one here about being Asian America, the in-betweens. So there's this voice of personal, but then there's this social pieces that you're taking from Ferguson and law. And how do you do that? How do you discipline yourself to not wanting to say all those 7 things, 7 ideas all at once in the first paragraph? Right?
Yeah. That's hard. That's hard. I'm a maximalist. Can't Stop, Won't Stop, Who We Be are both maximal kinds of books. Like, I've thrown everything in there and I've tried to figure out how to make it fit. But the necessity of narrative is key, right, to the whole process. If I'm not connecting, I could throw every fact in there that I know, but if I'm not connecting with you, then I can't get you to read to the end of the book, and we're not having any kind of communication there. And so Who We Be was a very long process. It took 8 years to do, and I had about the better part of 3 months to do this. So part of it was I had a short deadline, and part of it was thinking that I had overfussed on Who We Be. I'd spent way too much time on some things. There was one paragraph that I literally worked on for 8 years. And I'm happy with the way it ended up, I think. Today but I would still be working on it if I didn't have like a final deadline for that. And this one I just had like, you got to get this in March, and I'm like, okay. So I got it in April, and and I tweaked it until like printing, so I had like another month or so, and that was good because Lemonade came out. And so but there was a deadline. There was a hard and fast deadline, and so I went back to trying to be fast, and there's a lot of sentences in there that I would fix right now. When I read, sometimes I fix them when I'm reading. It is.
And of course, the book subtitle is to give you a little bit of wiggle room. There is notes on race and resegregation. So, you can just be sort of meander a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. 'Cause you're just writing these notes, these observations, and it's always intrigued me that incredible ethic of journalism that you bring to cultural critique and cultural writing, but also very anthropological, very ethnographic. You want to privilege the voice of people that you are actually talking to and places where you go, and it's hard to do that when you want to get a point across, and you want to tell an idea that you already are convinced is the super cool idea. So you seem to have worked your way to that kind of writing. And I think it's one of the reasons the Washington Post called you this book one of the smartest book of 2016, because it does that balance, and it leaves a lot of room for us to kind of keep writing a narrative. And how do you see the state of blogging and all of these sort of popular type of writing that are also part of organizing?
I mean, I'm a huge consumer of writing, and we're in the best of times in that, for sure. There's a number of amazing writers: Hua Su, Gia Tolentino, Jenny Zhang, like a whole bunch of people. I just could go on and on and on, who are writing in amazing ways. Kiese Lehman, so many people, and so I think we're in the best of times in that regard. I don't feel like I need to cover everything. I have to be able to add in and help out and stuff. But I feel really, really good about like laying back and letting all of my friends and colleagues and people whom I admire, do the thing. It's amazing. It's a really dope thing.
Jeff helped found a magazine that all of you can subscribe to and read it. It's called Color Lines, and it's some really great thinking, right, and writing there about culture and ethnicity and race. Thank you so much, everyone.